I would like to introduce our speaker tonight. I'm really thrilled that she is here. Dr. Reidenberg is a professor at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City, where she received her PhD in anatomy. She's a biomedical research scientist and educator. She's examined a large variety of animals from insects to humans, but cetaceans are her favorite. Joy's research and scientific expertise has earned her prestigious honors and awards. She became internationally famous for her work on documentaries, including the 18-part series Inside Nature's Giants. Dr. Reidenberg is a comparative anatomist, and tonight's lecture has 6 A's in the title, to remember it. Amazing anatomical adaptations allow aquatic abilities. Her talk will cover the many unique adaptations that allow whales to survive as mammals in an aquatic environment. Many of us were fortunate to meet Joy in person at the ACS Biennial Conference in Newport Beach several years ago. We were able to view a documentary film showing her inside the belly of a whale. And Dr. Reidenberg is a fascinating individual, and it's my pleasure to introduce her tonight. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
So I'm really happy to be here, and I hope that I can teach you something new today. I know a lot of you folks may be very familiar with whales, and so a lot of the things I may be saying might already be knowledge that you have, but I'm also going to assume that there are a lot of newbies out there who are not as familiar with whales. So I'm going to assume no knowledge and take you from, step 1 through the anatomy of whales and their amazing adaptations. So first I'm going to share my screen. Make sure we got that going right there. And then put this on. Okay, hopefully that's looking okay and everyone can see it.
Looks great.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so we've got amazing anatomical adaptations allow aquatic abilities. Well, I think I can shorten that to just ACS, right? Awesome cetacean specializations. And why not? So thank you, ACS, for inviting me. And let's take a look at what goes on with these whales. All right, why is my pointer not working? That's interesting. Something very strange about this. Okay, let's see what happens if I pointer on this side. Okay, at least that side works. Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties. So cetaceans, as I'm sure you folks are all aware of, involves lots of different types of animals that are whales, but they're all different shapes, so there's all different sizes. There's differences between those that have teeth and those that don't. And when we talk about whales, we include dolphins and porpoises in that category of whales. So cetaceans are whales, including dolphins and porpoises. We've got a humpback whale on the upper left. We've got a killer whale or orca on the upper right, which is actually really just a very, very big dolphin. We've got a dolphin on the lower left, and we've got an Amazon River dolphin next to it, just to show some huge variations in not only habitats, but also colorations. And then on the lower right is a porpoise. And I love this particular one. It's a spectacle porpoise, but it always looks to me like the little makeup artist, because if you look carefully, it's got lipstick and eyeshadow. So that is a fun little animal. But as you know, there is many, many, many different types of whales in the world. So I love this particular poster because it shows all the baleen whales on one side, and they're all facing towards your right. And all the toothed whales on the other side, and they're all facing towards your left. And just for reference in there, that's not a whale. That just so you know what size, these whales are relative to a person. So those that have baleen in their mouths, we call mysticetes. And literally that word means mustached whales, because the baleen plates that hang from their upper jaw look kind of like a broom or a mustache, a very hairy looking thing. And CT is the part that means whale, misty means mustache. On the other hand, on the other side are the odontocetes, and that is a word that means toothed whales, And so, as you know, you'll see lots of animals that have big teeth in their mouths, like killer whales or sperm whales. But there are also some animals in this group that may never erupt teeth, or they may only erupt one tooth, like the narwhal, or may only erupt two teeth, and maybe only in the males, like some of the beaked whales, where those two teeth actually are more like antlers than they are like teeth, because they certainly don't use them for feeding. They use them more for aggressive displays. So let's talk a little bit about whale shapes. So whales are very hydrodynamic. They're very streamlined. They look kind of like a torpedo or a missile. They have a tiny little front that widens very dramatically in a sort of V shape, and then it narrows again to the same V on the tail. That is not at all how most people draw whales. So if you've ever seen drawings of whales, they kind of look like big, fat, round, tubby things with, floating on the top of the water like a cork. That's clearly not a whale. If you see some of the logos for some of the preppy clothes that have a whale on it, and you may know what I'm talking about without mentioning any particular trademark names. But those are not what whales generally look like. They may be a little bit inspired by sperm whales, which have a squarish head. But other than the sperm whale, no other whale should be floating around with a square head. So most of those drawings are not depicting the majority of whales. So we have a very streamlined shape. And as you also know, I'm sure, whales have horizontal tails, and they pump them in an up and down movement with their spine, which is actually reminiscent of their ancestors that were galloping on land, as opposed to fish, which have a vertical tail and horizontal spinal movements. So if you think about the whole evolution of this movement, what's happened is fish evolving into amphibians and eventually into reptilian animals kept the horizontal spinal movements. And you can still see that today. If you look at a snake, it wiggles from side to side, or even an alligator, it's walking, or a lizard, it's still going from side to side. But when we transitioned evolutionarily to mammals, the legs came from the side of the body underneath the animal and lifted the belly off the ground. That enabled these mammals to leap and gallop, but it also enabled them to have a pregnancy because their belly wasn't dragging on the ground anymore. So this advantage of this body position meant that the spine had to move in an up and down fashion instead of the side to side. That was a tremendous transition from the reptilian pattern to the mammalian pattern. When the ancestors of whales went back into the water, they kept that up and down vertebral or spinal movement, even though they didn't need to worry about dragging their belly on the ground, because now they're in water. They still have the up and down spinal movement. And when they are swimming through the water, they are essentially using the up and down spine as if they were galloping on land, just without the legs. But it's the same kind of action. So it's pretty cool to see that and realize that that's all part of their evolutionary history. Now, whales have projections that stick out of their bodies, and they all begin with F. There's the flipper or pectoral flipper, which is the forearm. There's the fin or dorsal fin, which is on the keel on the back. And there are the flukes or the paddles on the tail itself. And each one of these appendages, if you were to do a cross-section through them, have the same kind of fusiform shape where it's like a blunt leading edge, gets fatter in the middle, and then trails off gently to a streaming edge at the back end. This is the same design that you would see if you did a cross-section through an airplane's wing. It's the same design that you would see if you did a cross-section through the keel on a sailboat. This is a very hydrodynamic shape. In particular, this shape also allows for lift because one surface may be more curved than the other. You see that in particular on the pectoral flippers, which is that first cross-section. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but if you can, I'm going to move it over here to highlight this one. This is the first cross-section. And you'll see that the top edge is a little bit more curved than the bottom, but not by a lot. But that means that if the water flows over the top faster than it flows over the bottom, it would create lift, like an airplane wing. So they can use their flippers for lift. So looking at airplane wings and realizing that they're basically like pectoral flippers, whales, of course, have an advantage over airplanes because they can also use their flippers to bank their turns and brake as well as lift because there's mobility in there. How do airplanes do it? Well, they don't actually move their wings around, but what they do instead is they pull down these flaps at the back of the wings. You may have seen it if you've ever flown on a plane. When it comes into land, they pull those flaps down to create more friction and use their braking. Whales simply have to tilt their flipper, and they accomplish the same thing, and they can get braking. Planes would have to put their engines in reverse to really brake, but a whale can actually pull the flippers down and point the tips of them down, and that creates a huge amount of surface area and creates a much stronger braking action for them. They can also elevate one flipper and lower the other one and bank their turns much more easily than an airplane. So they have a lot more maneuverability than airplanes do. But you can see how airplanes are sort of built on the same kind of body plan. And if you look at the tail of an airplane, that is essentially the dorsal fin. It's just displaced to the back. But that dorsal fin is important for preventing the airplane from flipping over. So when we look at a dorsal fin of a whale, and you can see a nice close-up of one on the lower left, if we then compare it to the keel on the sailboat, which is on the lower right, but just flip it upside down, we realize that it is built essentially the same way it's built on a whale. It's the same design, same shape. So much of our stuff is really inspired from nature. All the technologies that we're using to be hydrodynamic or fluid dynamic in the air are based on what whales are doing. So there are many different directions in which these whales have to worry about their orientations, and we have names for all of them. So if the animal flips from left to right, that's called roll. If it goes along that red axis backward or forward, that's called surge. If it turns to the left or right along that green axis, that's called yaw. If it gets lifted by a wave or it sinks, that's heave. And if it simply drifts to the left or right, that's sway, going left or right. And it can also roll around that axis, and that would be called pitch. That's the up and down movement that you see as these whales are swimming. All of these different directions and movements are regulated by those appendages that stick out from the whale. So they're really important for controlling the whale's movements because unlike most terrestrial animals, which are living on basically on the land, right? So they don't have a lot of three-dimensionality to their movements. Whales are going up and down the water column. So they have a very three-dimensional environment that they live in. They're not living in a planar environment the way we are. Okay, let's go through whale anatomy looking at it system by system. So as a comparative anatomist, that's how I view the world. And I'm going to take you through the various organ systems of these animals and show you what's special. I'm going to start with the musculoskeletal system, but I am not going to list and name every single muscle in the whale. That would just take us until next week. So we're not going to do that. But you should know that aside from the fact that it's missing hind limbs, a lot of the torso muscles are very similar in the torso area of the whale. The biggest difference is that whales don't have much of a neck. So a lot of the muscles that we use to turn our head from side to side are atrophied in the whales because they don't do that kind of motion. They can do an up and down motion like you're doing a yes motion. They're very bad at doing the no motion. There are a few exceptions to that where you have some animals that actually do have more of a neck, like the river dolphins. They have very flexible necks. But most of these animals that are in the pelagic oceans, if they had a flexible neck, that would be a disadvantage for them. Why? Because in a river, you need to maneuver around objects like mangrove roots and rocks and things like that. So you need some flexibility. But in the open ocean, you want to go really fast and you want to go in a straight line. And if you turn your head to the side, it actually presents more friction to your forward motion. And so having a stiffer neck that doesn't allow the head to turn from side to side limits the action to just the up and down, which we're going to get to later, so that they can efficiently swim without getting extra friction. Okay, let's talk about flippers. Now, the most amazing flippers belong to the humpback whale because it has the longest flippers. They're really, really huge. The diagrams on the bottom are showing you not to scale. Each one of them has been adjusted to be the same height. But in reality, a killer whale's flipper is very tiny compared to a humpback whale's flipper. But what we're seeing is some of the homologies of the different bones that are in these flippers. A flipper is not just a hand. It's comprised of all the bones of the entire upper extremity. So that H that's at the top of each one of those diagrams is the humerus, which is your arm bone from the shoulder to the elbow. The R and the U are the radius and the ulnar, which are the forearm bones. We have two bones in the forearm between the elbow and the wrist. And all of these whales have the same thing. Then we get to the wrist area itself, which in some whales never ossifies, like the killer whale. And so you get, it's just drawn in white there because we're not seeing anything. Same thing in the right whale. In other whales, you sometimes get some occasional ossifications of bone in there. So you get the little gray lumps that you see in the sperm whale. Those are the wrist bones. Now in us, we have a lot of wrist bones, and that allows the flexibility. So if you look at your own wrist and you twist your hand around, you'll see that even if you keep your forearm still and don't bend at your elbow, you still can roll your hand around in a complete circle because your wrist allows a lot of flexibility. Whales don't have that. It's pretty fused in there. So they do not flex their wrist separately, and they don't bend their elbow like we do separately. So all of these things look different in a whale, even though it's the same bones, they don't have the same functionality. All of it is much stiffer so that they can use it like a paddle, so that they can do things like braking and banking turns and so on. Most of the flexibility for these whales actually comes in the fingers. Now, the fingers are the purple and green parts that you see in this diagram. The purple parts correspond to the metacarpals, which in humans are the part that forms the palm of your hand area. So it's between the wrist and the beginnings of your fingers. And the blue parts are the fingers themselves. Now, one of the things that's really cool about whales is they've maintained the same pattern, even though it's one big lumpy flipper, they still have the pattern of having individual fingers in there. In some whales, they've streamlined that a bit and lost one of the digits. So they've gone from 5 digits to 4 digits, which is very interesting. We see digit reduction in a lot of animals. If you look at, for example, cloven-hoofed animals like cattle or sheep or deer, they're walking on only 2 of the fingers. They used to have 5, but there's been reduction evolutionarily to 2. If you look at a horse, it's only walking on the nail of 1 finger. That hoof is the nail, and inside are the bones of just the middle finger. So finger reduction is not a new idea in evolution. It does allow these animals to have some streamlining of their flipper shape, but it's funny that, to me, that they still maintain 5 fingers in most species, but then they've done something really curious. They've added extra parts to the fingers. So when you look at your own finger, you know, there's the main knuckle joint where if you make a fist and you want to punch someone, right? You've got that main knuckle joint. Then you've got another set of knuckle joints, the one between the punching one and like where you would put a ring, for example, on your finger, okay? And then you have one more set. Well, that means that in each of those fingers, you have 3 bones. Your thumb is an exception, it only has 2, so the thumb kind of got shortchanged. But the other ones have 3 bones. But if we look at some of these animals like the humpback whale, for example, look at how many digits are in that second, how many phalangeal bone elements are in that second digit or second finger. And I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I see 8. It's pretty incredible. So why would evolutionarily they add extra elements when they're reducing the rest of the flipper? It's for flexibility at the tip. So having lots of little joints along the way means that they can bend it at each one of those little white spots, which is cartilage and joint. So a humpback can actually caress another whale with its flippers. It can actually curl them around because there's a little bit of movement in each one of those. And the more joints you have, the more movement you have. So think of it like, if you look at a train on the tracks, right? Each train car isn't very flexible, but if you have many, many cars on the train, it can snake around the corner because there's bending at each one of those joints where one train car meets the next. It's the same idea happening here. Now, that brings an interesting question to mind, which is, why is there so much cartilage in the flipper? It is for flexibility. And what's cool about that is that adults still have that flexibility. We call that a pedomorphic condition, which means it's like a child, like ped means pediatrics, okay? So a pedomorphic condition means that these whales don't mature the way a normal mammal matures. They maintain a skeleton that looks like a child throughout most of their life. And they don't close over the growth plates where there's cartilage. They keep those cartilage plates going throughout their whole life. That is a a very unusual thing in mammals, because most mammals, as they age, they actually solidify all of that area. They solidify the bone and they have less flexibility. But whales maintain this specifically for flexibility. And by the way, if you don't know this, the scientific name for humpback whale is Megaptera novaangeli, which simply means the big winged New Englander, because it has those very, very long flippers. So speaking of flippers, we know that they evolved from a forelimb, and we were talking about the homologies of those different bones, and you can see in the diagram on the upper right where the same bones are in different animals, even if their forelimb has many, many different types of shapes. So, for example, colored in orange is the radius of a human. You can see again in the cat a radius. There's the radius in the whale, and then you see a radius in a bat. It's the same bone, different shapes for different functions, whether it's a wing, whether it's a limb with claws, or it's a manipulating appendage like we have. That bone is going to change its shape. So if we look at the evolutionary history of whales, we start with a small little deer-like animal that was roughly wolf-sized, but more like a deer, because it actually walked on little hooves. It didn't actually look like a wolf, but it was just wolf-sized. But if we look at that forelimb, and if we go down the left side of the image, you'll see the forelimbs gradually become more alligator-like underneath the animal. So we started with our mammal, which was raising its belly up off the ground. And now it's almost like we're going in reverse for evolution, back to a reptilian condition where the belly's getting lower to the ground. The difference here is that the legs are not splayed out to the side like they would be in an alligator. So they're still lifted off the ground, but they're very, very flexed. And that allowed the animal to be low in the water level in a shallow water and hide its body in the water. Eventually, these animals took off into open water and weren't necessarily resting on the shores. And so the need for having stabilizing appendages that they could rest in shallow water with was not necessary. So the front limbs became the paddles or the flippers that we know of today. If we take a look at the hind limbs, it's an even more interesting story because they disappear. But one of the things that we see in some of the intermediate steps is a very interesting arrangement of bones. And it's called the astragalus. And this astragalus has a double pulley. You can see where these two arrows are pointing. There's a pulley above and a pulley below, and that's where the tendons are sliding over it. That is something you see in artiodactyls. Artiodactyls are the animals that chew their cud, like deer and cattle and sheep and goats. And we know because we see that same pattern in some of the Eocene and Protocoetid whales that their ancestors must have been related to artiodactyls, because that's the only other place you find that kind of double pulley in the hind limb. But when we finally get to the truer whales, as we get into the more pelagic animals, the hind limb disappears into a tiny little nubbin, and everyone usually describes this as being a vestigial limb because you have this tiny little limb. To me, it kind of reminds me of a backwards T-Rex. T-Rex has tiny little front legs and really big back legs. Well, these guys have really big front legs and tiny little back legs. So they're backwards. And I would not actually describe those hind legs as vestigial. And that's because everything in nature has a function. It just may change its function. So the function you assumed it was supposed to have, like locomotion, may not be its primary function anymore. But there's still a function. Otherwise, it would completely disappear. And eventually it does. But in the intermediate stages, before it disappears, it still has a function. I think the main function of these hind limb extremities that were left, that look kind of like little, nubbins there, was actually in reproduction. Because you see a very similar pattern in sharks. They're called claspers. So when a male shark mates with a female shark, it uses the claspers to grasp the opening, like a cloacal opening of the female, so that sperm can be put in. It is possible that these fossil whales that had hind limbs, little tiny hind limbs, may have just been the males that we were seeing. Females may have not had them at all. And we may have been classifying them as another species. That's a whole nother discussion we can get into. But it could be that those hind limbs were really just claspers for reproduction. Very cool idea. Now, Here's a very interesting animal. This is a dolphin that was found that had hind limbs. How weird is that to have hind limbs in a modern dolphin today? What this tells us is that there was a mutation that activated the suppressed genetic code for a hind limb. What that means is that hind limbs were in the DNA of these animals, which means their ancestors had hind limbs. It's the best proof we have that these animals evolved from a four-legged ancestor because the genetics for the hind legs are still there. And every once in a while, in an animal like this, it can become expressed because that genetics that's normally turned off can get turned on accidentally because of some weird mutation. So that's a really very cool phenomenon to see. Whales also have a pelvis, and the pelvis is really important, not for the things that we think of for a pelvis, right? We think of our pelvis as being the bone that holds the thigh bones so that we can then support our weight and walk on it. But pelvis actually has another function, and that really is important in reproduction because the pelvis supports the bowl, essentially, that holds the fetus in the mother. And it holds the organs of the body so that they basically don't fall out the bottom of, the space between your legs. But it also has another function in whales, and that is that it also holds the muscles that are responsible for swimming. So the muscles of the belly region that help flex the whale in a downward position are attached to that pelvis as well. So it's important in locomotion. In addition, the pelvic bones in male whales tend to be a bit larger because they also anchor the muscles that retract the penis. Now, this is something that's kind of unusual because most animals don't push a penis out and retract it, they erect it. But in whales, it has to be completely withdrawn so that the animal is hydrodynamic when it's swimming. So there's a muscle that is called retractor penis that simply pulls the penis inward, and it's anchored on this pelvic bone. So it's very important to have a very strong pelvic bone. Let's go to the other side of the animal, look at the neck region. So the neck of whales is highly compressed. There are a few exceptions, which I mentioned before, like the river dolphins, but for the most part, these animals have these very compressed vertebrae, and as we were saying before, it keeps the head aligned and reduces friction from turning the face to the left or the right, where it would present a wide surface that could prevent the forward movement. If we look at these vertebrae that are in front of us here, you see them labeled as C1 and C2. C stands for cervical, which is simply the Latin word for neck. So C1 and C2 are actually looking like one bone. They're fused together. And if you look closely, you'll see that C3 through C6 are also fused to C1 and C2 and to each other. So in fact, from C1 to C6 are all fused into one unit, although we see little flanges of where they used to be. So again, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but if you can, this is C1 and this is C2. This is C3, 4, 5, 6. And this one over here is C7. This particular species has a separate C7. There are other ones where this can be fused as well. But we never have more than 7 cervical vertebrae in any mammal. Even giraffes only have 7 cervical vertebrae. So that is a normal pattern that we see throughout all mammals. But in whales, they're simply all clunked together as one big unit. And then T1 simply stands for the first thoracic or chest vertebra. And it looks different from the others. You see this little hook sticking out here? That's where the first rib would attach. So these neck ones don't have attachments for ribs, but this first one of the chest does have the first attachment for a rib. Now, there's another thing I want you to notice, and that is these little bumps here overlap each other. That nests one vertebra into the neck so that even in the thoracic region, and it will continue down, there's very little movement from side to side because of these little flanges. They kind of remind me of like the wings on a wing chair that keep your head from lopping off from one side to the other. So it really interlocks laterally. And if we look at the skeletons of a whale, there are these little flanges. I don't know if you can see my arrow here, but there are little flanges that stick out. They're kind of V-shaped because there's a left and a right aspect to it. And each one of those interlocks with the spinous process, which is the up and down part of the vertebra in front of it. You see the same thing in the baleen whales too. They have these little interlocks here. All of these little interlocks keep the skeleton aligned so that they can slide up and down, but not move side to side. It doesn't mean that the whale can't move side to side. It can throw its tail to the side because the interlocks are less prominent in the tail region. But in the area of the torso, that is the area where the ribs are and the area where the abdomen is, where all the belly organs are, there's less side-to-side movement in that body. The other thing that we notice is that these vertebral spines are very tall, and then there are these spines that stick out towards you, facing out towards you. So they make a shelf, and you can see them over here in this diagram. These are the ones facing towards you. These are the ones that are going straight up. And in that shelf is a pile of muscle called epaxial muscles, which simply means epi means above, axis means the axis or the straight line of the middle of the body. So these are the muscles above that axis, and hypaxial are the muscles underneath it. So we've got two big groups of muscles without going into all the individual ones called epaxials and hypaxials. And they work in concert with each other. When the epaxial contracts, the hypaxial relaxes. When the hypaxial contracts, the epaxial relaxes. And that's what allows the up and down movement. So if we look at a cross section through a whale, and I'm sorry for those of you, I didn't warn you, I was going to show you a gross anatomy picture. There's going to be more, so I hope you can handle it. These are cross sections taken through the body of a dolphin. Here's the spine in the middle. I hope you can see this arrow, otherwise I'm just talking and no one knows what I'm talking about. But hopefully you can see there's a spine here. This is where the spinal cord is. This spine going straight up would be the part going up towards the dorsal fin, but not into the fin. It's just going up towards the back of the animal. And these lateral projections here are holding the shelf of the epaxial muscle. Underneath it is the hypaxial muscle, and here's all the gutsy stuff in the middle. And that section is roughly right over here. If we move down to an area like right over here at the base of this dorsal fin, you see a little dorsal fin right over here. Okay, so here's a section taken here, right through this area. And we're starting to see less gutsy stuff and more of the hypaxial musculature. And finally, when we get down to this region over here, in the beginning of the tail, we have very little gutsy stuff left and a lot of muscular coming in this area. So now we're starting to get more balance between the muscles on top and the muscles on the bottom. So this is the real powerhouse that makes the tail go up and down. It's just alternating contractions of the top ones versus the bottom ones, back and forth, top, bottom, to do the pumping up and down.
And Dr. Reidenberg, I'm just letting you know, we can see your cursor, so you are good for all of these episodes.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. So I don't feel so stupid now saying, look at my cursor, and then no one's there.
No problem.
All right, great. So the other thing to notice is that this musculature, which is in this area, will actually disappear by the time you get to here, because over here, it's just going to be tendons. And so that's why this tail narrows dramatically. There's no bulk here. It's just tendons. Tendons are really cool things because they allow movement at a distal point from where the muscle is located. Let me show you by looking at the next slide so you can see this better. As we move from the beginning of the tail all the way towards the end of the tail, what we start to see is the muscles get less and less. The tail gets smaller and smaller until all we have in here are these little gray things. These are tendons. These little bundles in here are tendons. So a tendon allows movement without the bulk of the muscle getting in the way. Look at your own hand for a minute, and you'll see how a tendon works, okay? I want you to spread your fingers out straight and then curl them up into a ball, like you're making a fist. Now, you did that by contracting muscles that are actually in your forearm. And when you do that, the tendons that could all go all the way to the tips of your fingers are pulling your fingertips down so that you get that curl, because they're actually anchored along the finger. So they nested against your finger and they cause that curling motion. If we didn't have tendons at the tips of our fingers and we had the muscle bulk moved from our forearm into our hand, then every time we tried to grasp something, the muscle bulk would be so large in our hand, it would actually pop whatever we're grasping out of our hand. You wouldn't be able to pick up a ball because every time you tried to put your fingers around the ball, it would pop out of your palm because of the muscles getting big. So if you move that muscle bulk down to your forearm, now you can open and close your fingers and notice the bulk moving in your forearm while your fingers are open and closing. because the tendons are doing the job all the way out at distal tips. The same thing happens with a whale or a dolphin. So the bulk of the muscles is closer to the middle of the body. The tendons go all the way to the tip, and that allows the tail to have a very skinny shape to it. Now, why is that important? Is because the tail is kind of built like an old-fashioned broadsword. It's very flat side to side, but the cutting edges of the sword would be the equivalent of the very top and very bottom of these cross sections. So imagine this. This is like a cross section through a broadsword. This would be a cutting edge, and this would be a cutting edge. Literally, it's cutting through the water like a sword, going up and down, up and down. Why can it do that? Because it doesn't have a lot of bulk in it anymore. It's just tendons. So it's a really ingenious design that allows this kind of nearly frictionless movement of cutting the water, slicing the water like a sword, and having all the power be towards the middle of the animal where the muscles are actually bulked up. Okay, let's talk about another adaptation. Let's talk about diving adaptations. Whales have lungs because they're air-breathing animals, and we'll get to respiratory tract in a minute, but their lungs have no lobes in them, which is pretty weird when you think about it. So why would their lungs not have lobes? All other animals that we know of have lobes for their lungs, and the purpose of having various lobes to your lungs means that if you have an infection in your lung, you can wall off that lobe. It's sort of like closing a door in your house when it has a smell. It's like, oh, I'll close the bathroom door so we don't have to smell that smell everywhere. Let me close the kitchen door so we don't have to smell the smoke from mama burning everything, in the rest of the house. You can wall off an infection the same way by closing off a portion of your lung, like closing a door. Whales can't do that. So you would think this is a disadvantage to not have lobes in their lungs. In fact, it's really an advantage for them for diving, because not having those complex doorways for the air to go through means that air evacuation into or air entrance as well as evacuation into and out of the lungs is more efficient. So when they breathe, they can move that air very quickly in and out of the lungs because it doesn't have to go through all those little doors. So that allows them to breathe basically the way we sneeze. So if you listen to a whale at the surface, you go out on a whale watch, you notice they come to the surface and explosively breathe very, very quickly and then go right back down again. That is because they don't have all the friction of sending the air in all these different contorted ways to get through different lobes. So that's a very cool thing. But the downside is that they, of course, could have an infection in there. And if there's an infection, they wouldn't be able to wall it off. And that's why many of the animals that come in stranded, they may have actually stranded because they have pneumonia. And if they didn't have it, they might get it during the stranding when they, accidentally inhale some water into their lungs. But that pneumonia can usually take these whales out because they can't wall off the infection.
Yeah.
Diana, did you want to say something? Question?
No,
Okay.
thank you. Sorry.
Okay. So then we've got lungs that have no lobes, but we also have air spaces that collapse and re-expand very easily. But they have ribs that accommodate that collapse and expansion. Now, why would the lungs need to collapse and expand? It has to do with pressures and understanding pressure differentials. As a whale dives deeper in the water around it adds pressure or weight to the whale. So when we're walking around at sea level, we have the weight of the entire atmosphere of the earth above us. Okay, we call that one atmosphere of pressure. It's just the weight of air on our shoulders as we're walking around. We're adapted to it, so we don't notice it. If you go down 33 feet of water, 33 feet of water is the equivalent of one atmosphere of pressure. It's just denser because it's water, not air. And so you accomplish one atmosphere at only 33 feet instead of everything from here all the way up to outer space. So a whale at 33 feet is now under 2 atmospheres of pressure. So whatever air was in the lungs is now under double the pressure. So the lung actually collapses to half the size it used to be. And for every 33 feet, this process continues and the lungs continue to collapse as they go deeper and deeper down and the pressure gets higher and higher. As lungs collapse, ribs need to accommodate that. Humans can only do it up to a certain depth, and then we risk breaking our ribs as we dive because our rib cage is not that flexible. But with whales, the ribs actually fold. They actually have a hinge on their rib cage that's like an elbow joint, and that allows the rib cage to fold up as the lungs collapse so that they can accommodate for the shrinking lung volume without breaking their bones. Very, very cool. Other adaptations they have, if you look at whale muscle, it's extremely dark. It looks almost black. That blackness comes from myoglobin in the muscle, and that allows these animals to hold a lot of air inside their, a lot of oxygen inside their muscles so that they don't build up an oxygen debt, so that they can hold their breath for a lot longer without having to oxygenate their muscles. We know this intuitively, believe it or not, for those of you who are not vegetarian, from the meats that you eat. You may have noticed that if you look at chicken meat, for example, there's the white meat pieces and there's the dark meat pieces. Why are they different? What's going on? Well, chickens are not great flyers. So their white meat muscle is really their slow muscle. It doesn't do a lot for them. They run around mostly with their leg muscle. So that's the muscle that's doing most of the work. So that's their dark meat. Whereas if you look at an animal like a duck, okay, it's also a bird, but all of it is dark meat. Why? Because ducks are flyers. So since they have to fly and migrate, they have dark meat for their breast muscle as well as their leg muscles. So they're paddling with the leg muscles, but they're also flying with the breast muscles. And so both of them are very, very active muscles, so they're dark. The more active the muscle has to be, the darker it is in color. That's why if you deprive an animal of movement, like a veal calf, its muscle ends up being very white. So veal meat is white compared to regular steak, which is very red, because veals are confined and they can't move around. So they don't develop the muscle that you need for moving around. Very cool. All of that difference in color is because of myoglobin. Whales have the darkest muscle in the animal world because they are holding the most amount of oxygen in their muscle, and that makes it very dark because of the myoglobin. Okay, let's talk a little bit about locomotion. We talked a bit about how the belly muscles have to attach to the pelvis to allow the animal to curl in a downward motion. But there's also another bone in the neck called the hyoid, and this hyoid allows the animal to move its head in a downward position. So that head is pulled from the tip of the jaw all the way down to this little white bone called the hyoid, and from there to the sternum. That allows them to depress the head in the down motion, which is the beginning of that whole body wave. So if we look at this video, watch the dolphin in the middle. Let's see if I can get this to move. Come on. There we go. And you'll see that its head is going up and down, up and down, up and down. What's happening is they're just dragging a camera behind the boat and the dolphins are following, but you can see the head is bobbing up and down, up and down, up and down, because that's how they initiate their swimming, that body wave. Okay, let's go to the next system. Let's look at cardiovascular system. So in the cardiovascular system, we want to take a look at the heart. And this is a actual heart from I think it was from a blue whale that was preserved and dissected out so you can see some of the vessels in it. It is actually pretty enormous, the size of this heart. The heart rate can drop to as low as 2 beats per minute during a dive. That's a pretty amazing feat when you think about it. So what's actually happening is these whales, remember, they've collapsed their lungs, so they're not taking on board more oxygen at depth. So if they've collapsed their lungs, there's no reason to circulate blood around anymore because there's no oxygen to come from the lungs to go anywhere. So you don't need to circulate blood anymore. That first circulation around that put all of that oxygen in the myoglobin was enough to last the whole dive. So the tiny little bit of beating that goes on with the heart is just to keep things from clogging up, and having clots. It's really not to circulate oxygen anymore. Another thing that happens with the vascular system is thermoregulation. So whales have what's called a countercurrent heat exchange mechanism. Warm blood is at the core of their body. They are warm-blooded animals. Why did it take so long for us to recognize that whales were not fish? Well, because the original classifications of what made something a fish had more to do with the touch of the animal. So when you touch a whale on the outside, it's not warm, it's cold. So they figured, oh, this is a cold-blooded animal, like fish. And that's how they got categorized as fish, initially. It had nothing to do with whether they breathe water. It was just they were cold on the outside. But the fact is that they're warm on the inside, but no one knew how to measure that back then. The warmth on the inside is maintained because as the blood goes to the periphery, it throws off its heat to the incoming blood that's coming from the periphery in the venous system. So the arteries have hot blood, and as the hot blood from here, from the core, goes out toward the periphery, it throws the energy from the heat to the incoming blood from the periphery that was cold, and it transfers it so that the core still is being fed by warm blood. So we've got hot blood in the middle and cold blood on the outside of the animal. And they arrange their blood vessels in such a way that it's very efficient to radiate heat radially around this hot vessel in the center to the cold ones that are on the periphery. That's called a counter current heat exchange system. So in addition to thermoregulation and conserving heat, they can also dilate if you want to radiate excess heat. So they can actually take the blood vessels that are closest to the surface of the skin and dilate them extra large to throw off more heat. So if they're in a very hot environment, a very hot day near the equator, they can actually lose heat to the outside world when they want to. And that happens on the flat, thin surfaces like the tail flukes or the dorsal fin. So this is an x-ray of a tail. This is the end of the tail bones. And notice in the flukes, there are no bones, just in the middle. But here are some of the blood vessels that are radiating heat on this animal. Veterinarians usually look for these vessels if they need to inject something into the dolphin, because these are very accessible. They're right near the surface. This is a dorsal fin. And notice these blood vessels going up to the dorsal fin to do the same thing. Anyone notice something weird about this dorsal fin? Look at that. There was an injury, a cut, probably a propeller cut that healed. But what happened to the blood vessels? They were stunted here because they got cut. And so there's no blood feeding this area. This part of the dorsal fin probably will become, in this animal, very necrotic because it's not being fed by any blood. And so this is why small injuries can actually lead to larger ones. It's not just the cut, it's the lack of blood supply to feed the rest of that tissue to allow it to heal. Once you've cut off its blood supply, it's doomed. Another cool thing about blood supply in these animals is this thing called a reedy mirabella, which literally means a wonderful web. This looks like a bag of worms. Look at this. It looks like spaghetti everywhere. These are blood vessels, and they're located along the spine. These are ribs. See these little lighter colored orangey things here? These are ribs, and the spine is just below this. It basically looks like this. So here is the spine inside the body of the animal, also showing you roughly where it would be located. All the organs would be in here. So the lungs would be over here. The heart would be down here. Here are the ribs. Each one of these is a rib. And this little area in here in between the ribs is what's being blown up here to show you that. Now, what is this little mass of worms? We think it actually serves diving because this is the major blood vessel that comes from the heart. So the blood coming out of the heart goes down this blood vessel, and it's from this vessel that all the major organs are fed. But they're fed by vessels that go downward to the body cavity to feed all of the important things like the stomach and the liver and the pancreas and the spleen and all that stuff, kidneys, whatever. Everything is fed from vessels coming off of this big blood vessel. Gravity works for these animals. So what happens is if there's any bubbles that are coming out of solution as the whale is rising to the surface, like might happen for a diver, right, who might suffer decompression sickness, these whales may be able to avoid it because the bubbles would stay on the top part of this vessel and the bubble-free blood would be at the bottom part going to each of these organs. So what happens to the bubbly stuff at the top? Well, it gets sucked into this spaghetti up here, which is really not feeding any vessels. It's just a big wad of spaghetti that can hold bubbles. And then when they get closer to the surface, there's probably, and we're still working on this, but there's probably some signal to release the blood from here back into the circulation. But where will it go? It won't go back to this big blood vessel. It'll go to this one over here, which is the vein that's returning back to the heart. Therefore, bypassing all the vital organs. So the blood laden with bubbles doesn't circulate to all the vital organs. It goes right back to the heart, and it goes to the right side of the heart, which pumps the lungs. And that allows them to exhale all of that bubble-laden stuff on their first breath at the surface. Now, what is it, the bubbles that they're trying to exhale? It's nitrogen, because the oxygen is being used in the muscles, but the nitrogen, that's a problem if nitrogen accumulates in the blood. And if it comes out of solution as the whales rise up, that's what causes the bends or decompression sickness in humans. But this may be one of the ways that whales avoid decompression sickness, is by sequestering bubbles away and releasing it only when they get to the surface. Okay, so speaking of bubbles and gas, let's talk about the respiratory system now. So whales have a splash guard at the top of their head. So if we look here, we see this is the nose. Right here, it's closed. You have two slits. Here, it's opened. See these two little things here? And here, it's really wide open. So it basically looks like a backwards nose on the top of their head. This front part here gets bulgier as they open up their nose, because the muscles that pull this open, their bulk is in here. So the more they open this, the bigger this splash guard gets, and it helps to deflect water away from the nostrils. A pretty cool and amazing arrangement. When they close it, this whole area will flatten out. And so as they dive down, they're very streamlined on the top of their head. It looks very flat. And on these videos, you can see various whales spouting. And what's cool in particular is watch when the air first comes out, it goes to the side and then straight up. Very weird. And that's because as they're pulling the nasal plugs out of the way, it changes the shape of the space that the air has to go through before it is exhaled. And those changes really are very species specific, which is why different blows of different whales can be identified at a distance, because each whale has a different shape to its blow based on unique anatomy of its nasal plugs. Sperm whales are probably the most unique because they blow off only to the left side, but that's because they only have one nostril and it's located on the left side. They don't have two nostrils like these baleen whales do. If we get to toothed whales, we're looking at just one nostril, just like with the sperm whale, except in most toothed whales, it's located a lot closer to the center of the top of the head. And what is actually controlling this is essentially the upper lip has moved back over the top of the forehead. And look at how this color pattern even tells you, look, it started here and it's sort of swiped backwards. So we have some pigment from the front that actually leaves a trail during that development. It's a really cool thing. So this stuff here that can be pulled forward to open up this is essentially an upper lip. So I don't know if you can see me in the little tiny square here in the Zoom, but if I'm going to get close to the camera, so hopefully you can see. Look at my upper lip. My upper lip, if I roll it backwards like this and cover my nose like that, that's essentially what is happening in a whale. This is the nasal plug that closes over their nose. And that's why you don't see lip movement at the front of a whale's face, because all of its muscles and tissue that were lips are now up in its nasal region, controlling the closure of its nose. Now, because they have such a complex nose, they make complex sounds using that nose. And I'm going to play a little video here showing a dolphin. It's going to whistle and it's going to echolocate. I want you to listen to hear some of those differences. So the whistle, be sort of bird-like chirping, and then you're going to hear the echolocation, which sounds a lot like farting. Here we go. So every time it faces towards you, that's when it's doing the echolocation. Now what's happening is that lip that used to be here that's rolled up to the top of the head, this is that upper lip, like I was showing you, curling back over the nose. This is what's vibrating to create echolocation pulse signals. And that's coming out of the forehead as those farting-like noises. Whistles, we're not entirely sure where they come from. They might come from one side as opposed to the other side being echolocation, because they have sound-producing structures on both sides. It's also possible that it may come from the larynx, which is the voice box, which is this thing over here. So this is the larynx. There's some controversy about whether or not it can make sound. Most experimental evidence seems to show that they do not use the larynx for sound production. However, there's some new information showing that it is possible that newborn animals still use the larynx as a very primitive way to cry, like the first initial baby cries, because it takes a baby dolphin or porpoise or killer whale about a month to learn how to echolocate. We know that from captive observation. So what's it doing in the meantime? It still has to talk to mama It has to have a way to do it. So it might be using the larynx for those initial baby cry sounds. And I'm going to show you what I think is going on there. So when we look at this head of this dolphin, we see the green areas here. These two structures can vibrate and make sound. And this structure may be able to vibrate. Let's take a closer look. This is what we call the larynx. Okay, so when I go backward a minute, you see this part here. It's in two projection parts up here like this. This is the windpipe or trachea down here. And it's this part here I'm going to focus on. So now we're looking at it. This is that part that was in green right over here. This is the larynx of a pilot whale. And it's often called the goose beak. And this is why, because if you imagine it kind of looks like a goose lying on its back, it has that same shape to it. It's pretty cool. But it is interesting to note that in a terrestrial mammal, the things that make sounds, like in you and I, the vocal cords or vocal folds, they run from front to back in the larynx. But that's not true in the whales. In the whales, instead, it runs almost perpendicular. So it's parallel to airflow. Therefore, this structure might actually be erected into the airstream and flutter, kind of like a flag in the breeze to make sound. This is not a new idea. You may have seen this if you ever heard someone play on a blade of grass.
You take a piece of grass, lay it between your thumbs. When you have it situated between your thumbs, all you have to do is bring your thumbs up to your mouth and blow.
It's pretty cool, right? So having a structure in the middle that can vibrate as air goes on either side can make a sound. And maybe that is where some of the initial baby cries are coming from. If you can tense that blade of grass, you can change the pitch. Listen to this guy when he does the sound.
You take a piece of...
That's all with a blade of grass. Pretty cool. Okay. And now my cursor's stuck. Let's go. Come on. All right. So we talked about the larynx having maybe folds in it and air going on either side of the folds. That would be over here. But this structure up here is where we do know sounds are made, at least in the adults. And that's from these two lip-like structures banging against each other on either side. As the air goes through these flaps or phonic lips, it then gets captured in these bags of air. And those bags allow for air recycling. So the air gets trapped there and then it can be sent back down and reused. A very, very interesting arrangement. So what we've got here essentially is the fat lip, which is, the lip I rolled back over my nose, which is now locked up against this area to close the blowhole so that water doesn't get in as the whale is diving. But then it can also create vibrations in this area. Now, what happens is as air goes into these sacs, it allows movement of the structures. So the fact that there's a sac over here on the front of the skull means that the stuff above it can slide back and forth because it's separated from the skull by having an airspace in there. So one function is to allow movement. It can amplify the vibrations. It may compensate for volume. In other words, if the animal takes a lot of air in these various black sacs with it as it dives, that's extra air to add to its total volume that it has to work with at depth. Because remember, as the animal is diving, pressure around it is increasing and the volume in those spaces is decreasing. So the more you take with you, the more you have to work with. Then you've got the capture and recycling. So as you use the air, it has to go somewhere and then it can be recycled. And then we have this thing called pressurization. And I don't mean the ambient pressure. I'm talking about pressure in the system. So I want you to try something. I want everyone who's on the Zoom to try this. I want you to make a sound. I can't hear you, but I'm hoping you're going to participate. Just go, ah, and put your fingers on your Adam's apple. As you do it, you will probably feel some vibration on your Adam's apple. For us, that vibration is lost energy. That's just going out, but we're not hearing it. You're hearing what's coming out of my mouth. But if you want to vocalize like a whale, you're going to go, got to close your mouth, right? Because whales don't have their mouth open when they're singing, right? But I'm still getting air out of my nose. You heard me? I'm humming. What happens if you do it and you close your mouth and your nose? So you go, It stops, right? Isn't that weird? Why does it stop? It stops because you pressurize the system. There's no place for the air to go anymore once you close the nose. So if you pressurize the system, there's no flow. If I had a balloon on the end of my nose, I could continue making sound. And that's exactly what these animals have done. They put balloons either in the larynx here or up here in the nasal region, and that allows the sound to continue to flow because, it allows the air to continue to flow, which allows vibrations to continue, which means it can continue to make sounds. So that keeps them from pressurizing the system. And then once the bag is filled, they take a moment of stopping making sound, send the air back down, and do the whole thing all over again. Why capture the air instead of just release it as bubbles? Because air's a precious commodity at depth. If you lose it, it's gone. You have to go back to the surface to get more. So this allows you to keep it and continue to use it over and over without losing it to the outside world. This is what it actually looks like. For those of you who don't like wet, gross dissection pictures, you can close your eyes for a minute. But this is a dissection of this dolphin head over here. Here's the eye, and here's the eye again over here for reference. Here's the front of the snout. Here's the front of the snout. This area that looks like a big forehead is actually a fat body that's used for focusing the sounds. And right behind it over here where the blowhole is, here's the blowhole. These are what the sacs actually look like. You see each one of this on a white card, so we can see that. And if we turn the head around like this so it's facing you and then zoom in, what we see here are the phonic lips. These are the actual lips that make the sounds. This one has been retracted out to the right. It normally would lie with this surface against this surface. And we notice that it has these very interesting little ridges on it and coloration patterns, all of which we're still trying to figure out what they do, but it probably adds to the malleability of the different types of sounds these animals can make because there's different properties in each of these stripes. This is some video footage of an endoscope put down the blowhole of a dolphin. And what I want you to see is that it's actually using those little phonic lips to make the sounds. So let's take a look over here. Can you see that? See that little vibration going on here? So as the animal is making little sounds, bubbling in that area. There we go. These are the two lips, left and right. Front and back on one side only. And it's making lots of bubbles. And if we look at this one, here's the one on the other side. It's not doing quite as much, but notice these weird patterns occurring on here. You're gonna see some stripes. Look, there they are. See the stripes? And the stripes change. They change to different, look at that, then go in a different direction.
Asking for pulses?
Very cool.
Very interesting. Look at the patterns on the mucosa of the posterior nasal passage there.
So all of that may be directing air in different ways and really adding to the vibrations that they can make. And here is looking at left and right sides at the same time.
Good boy.
This dolphin is being praised by its trainer, making some echolocation
Little bubbles
bubbles on
coming
one
up.
side.
No pulses. Little pulse there.
That high-pitched whistle is the trainer's whistle, just telling the dolphin it did the right thing.
Good boy.
Good, good, good,
Good.
good.
He whistled.
there, yeah.
Beautiful,
But
beautiful,
this is the first evidence that perhaps
beautiful, beautiful.
Buster.
echolocation is happening
How about
here,
we bridge this?
Oh,
and whistle
good,
is happening.
beautiful. This baby, as good as it ever gets.
You've already said that twice.
Make some
today.
noise.
More pulses.
Make some noise.
I'm asking. I wasn't asking for whistles, Todd, I promise.
All right.
He's being very quiet, very comfortable.
Very good.
Got left and right. They're both at 2.5 centimeters. They're both looking at the same anatomy.
Hey, there was one. We get that.
That was a little from the left
That
side.
was the left side. Oh,
Yes. Boy.
Oh, good boy.
Okay, Jen, this is just very good views. If we can get a little more here. It's so difficult to get.
Okay, I think you got the idea on that one. All right. So what we got here is a left and right side where you can make sounds kind of reminiscent of what happens in birds. Now, birds don't use a larynx, they use a syrinx, which is simply a valve like a larynx, but it's lower down. It's where the windpipe breaks into the left and right sides and goes to each lung. This is what happens in a bird when it's making sounds. That these alternating vibrations on the left and right side. So it's possible that the dolphins are doing something like that as well. If they are making sounds on the left and the right side, but at different frequencies on one side versus the other, then they could basically be making sound in stereo. Kind of like when we look with our two eyes at something. If we look at something with only one eye, we have trouble with depth perception. But when we have two eyes, we have two different angles on the same view, and we can correlate that together to get a three-dimensional view of something so that we have depth perception. Do the same thing with sound. If you just use one side to make sound, it's a pretty flat echo returning. You just know there's an object there. But if you have two things making sounds at two different frequencies, the brain may be processing those two different sounds separately and putting it together to get a more three-dimensional picture. Okay, let's take a look at a very different animal, a sperm whale. Sperm whales are essentially one gigantic nose swimming around with the tail. So that big square head is all about sound production. So air is coming up from the larynx this way, going through the skull, which is the white part there, just for orientation. This is where the brain is, and this is the rostrum or the beak of the sperm whale. It goes from there to the very front of the animal where there are a pair of these lips, but they only have one set of lips. They don't have a left set and a right set. They just have one set. From there, that vibration goes through this yellow sac called the spermaceti sac, which is filled with oil. And then from there, it reflects off of a air sac that's in front of the skull, and then goes down through this area, kind of like a megaphone. And this megaphone starts narrowing, gets wider. It's like patterns, which is what you're hearing right now. And notice that these are alternating densities. It's thought that this may be some type of condensing filter, but we're not exactly sure. This is what those lips look like at the front of the sperm whale. So this is the front of the sperm whale's head over here. This is the top of the head up here. The blowhole is this actual line right over here, I believe. And this is where the air would exit. But this is the air coming out of the top and bottom of these two lips that are at the front of the head. If we go underneath at the very bottom where the megaphone part is, this is the fat of the megaphone area. Notice it's alternating yellow and pink. This is the alternating densities of tissue that may be some kind of condensing filter. Pygmy sperm whales are not exactly built like a sperm whale. They're kind of like a little bit of each. They have some sperm whale features and some toothed whale dolphin-like features. So this is the area of where the phonic lips are, where they make sounds. But this sac over here is the equivalent of the spermaceti sac. So they make their vibrations over here, and then it runs through this weird looking sac over here. So it's a slightly different arrangement. Now let's get to baleen whales. Now baleen whales are completely different because they don't use their nose for making sounds. Instead, they use their voice box, which is this big structure right down over here. So here's the nose, here's the voice box, here's the lungs. What's going on here? Well, baleen whales are a lot harder to study than the toothed whales, which are small and easy to study in captivity. So when we look at baleen whales, we have to wait for something big like this to wash in. This is me dissecting a fin whale. I'm the person in the middle with the red hat. This is my scalpel over here. This is about the size of a whale's larynx, which you can imagine, trying to work on the organ of vocal production in the whale is very hard when it's bigger than you are. And if we look at, and this is from a much smaller whale, it's from a minke whale. If we look at this larynx, what we realize is that the larynx of baleen whales is an enormous organ. The larynx, which is bracketed there in the yellow, is about the size of a lung. Imagine if your voice box was the size of your lung. Your neck isn't big enough to hold an organ that big in your neck. So what's going on with whales? Because they don't have a neck. Well, this organ is really taking up the front part of the chest, because there isn't much neck, but it's a really, really big organ, which tells us it's really important. If we cut that organ open, and I know this may be a little hard in orientation, but what we've done is we've cut the very back of the organ open and pulled it off to the side. Inside it is this U-shaped structure. That is actually the vocal folds or vocal cords of a baleen whale. And as the left and right side of those come together, they are vibrating and probably creating the sounds. And in addition, remember we talked about an air sac for recycling air. Well, in this image on the side, this is my arm being shoved down into what is a sac underneath here. So it's just showing you my fist is down here, my elbow is over here, this is my shoulder over here, this is my head up here. And so that's how long this sac is. And this isn't a baby whale. In addition, there are these things called flaps. So we don't know what the flaps do, but we know that they're very species specific because there's flaps on the front that can clap together and maybe make pulse sounds. They're big in minke whales. They're very tiny in humpback whales. So again, we don't really know what that means. It's something we're still actively looking at. There's more than one sound source in these whales. Sounds might be coming from the thing like the cat, that farting kind of pulsing noise. That could be from the flaps, where the more squeaky door hinge kind of sound you heard at the beginning, maybe that's coming from the vocal folds. So if we look at these two different ways of making sound, one is to go send air between the vocal folds, and one is to send air between the flaps up here. Here's that larynx, here's the flaps, here's where the vocal folds are. What's happening is air goes through there. That's a very floppy kind of sound. That's a more squeaky sound. So maybe it was doing flap noises and then fold noises. That's possible. Okay. Two different ways of making sound. Maybe they do them at the same time. So what happens if they do them at the same time? This animal is making two sounds at once. Those are chords. So what do we think is really happening with this sac? Is it maybe acting a lot like a bagpipe? So if we turn our little bagpiping whale upside down, that's basically what these whales look like as they're singing with their head in a downward position. Air coming from the lungs would then accumulate in that sac up here. Now the sac may be acting like the beginning of a bagpipe. You ever heard someone turn on a bagpipe? It makes this really weird sound, okay? It drives the air through the folds or the flaps, producing that fundamental frequency. That's it. Okay? But that's not the sound that makes the song. That's just the beginning sound. What about the song that's coming from the pipes? Well, those are the air spaces that determine the harmonics. So those are the other pipes connected to it. Like that. If you put them together, you get the classic bagpipe, which is going to have tissue movements that control the song, but you still hear that fundamental frequency. Right? You heard the song, but there was always that droning sound in the back. So that could be what humpback whales are doing when they're making two sounds at once, like a bagpipe. That's not unique, by the way, to bagpipes. Humans can do it too. This is a throat singer or an overtone singer. I want you to take a look at this x-ray as we play. It's a moving x-ray. This is to give you the orientation. Here's the tongue, here's the voice box, here are the vocal folds. Watch what happens as this person makes sounds. Did you hear that? There was a higher whistly kind of sound, and then there was a constant tone the whole time. And then, so he's doing two things at once. Pretty cool. How would whales do it? Well, one mechanism we mentioned might be the flaps versus the folds. Another mechanism might be simply controlling within the larynx whether the vibration is between the folds or the vibration is each fold independently against a fat body on top of it. These are cross sections taken through the middle of the larynx here, like that. So in that case, we could have a vibration here, separate from a vibration here, perhaps at two different frequencies, creating two different sounds at once. And then these animals are in a head down position because that allows them to radiate sound in a more horizontal plane. So the sound's coming out of them and continuing out like this and, you know, all the way out. Now, one of the cool things about looking at these vocal folds as an anatomist is to understand the evolution of these two very different patterns, even though these are all whales. They've gone in two evolutionarily different directions. Tooth whales, although they make most of their sounds up here, initially might have made sounds down here. And their vocal folds, which are normally running between item 1 and item 2 here on a terrestrial animal, that number 1 position is moved forward, and the number 2 position is moved inferiorly. So they've reoriented their fold from going across the airway to parallel to airflow. Whereas the baleen whales have moved in the opposite direction. They've taken that number 1 position and moved it caudally towards the tail. Their folds are also parallel to airflow, but they're 180 degrees opposite from what we had in the toothed whales. It's very interesting that we have 2 completely different evolutionary trajectories, and that results in 2 very different functional results. We've got high frequencies in the toothed whales, low frequencies in the baleen whales. We've got perhaps 2 nasal sources and maybe a laryngeal source in toothed whales, and we've got 2 or 3 laryngeal sources in baleen whales. We've got multiple nasal sacs in toothed whales, whereas we have 1 big laryngeal air sac in the baleen whales. We've got clicks and whistles in toothed whales, and we've got pulsed and tonal sounds in the baleen whales. We have a path that's focused by the melon. The melon is this area here that acts like an acoustic lens, whereas in the baleen whales, it seems to pass just through the throat tissues. We've got echolocation in toothed whales, and maybe some sort of coarse version of echolocation, kind of like a blind person tapping their stick for the baleen whales when they make pulsed sounds. Maybe they get some very, very rudimentary echolocation from that. And then, of course, there's the communications and the songs. Okay, I know that I'm over time, but I'm hoping if those of you still want to make this a later night, I can go on to a few other systems. So I'm going to keep going. But I'll understand if those of you who can't stay more than an hour need to leave. I apologize that I'm going over time, but it's okay. I won't be offended if you leave. But those of you who want to stay, I'm going to keep going on with more systems. So here we go. I'm seeing a lot of claps and fingers and upright. Oh, yay. Okay, so you want me to do it? I'm going to do it. All right, digestive. Let's get into the differences between baleen and teeth here. Well, we all know that baleen whales have baleen. And we know that baleen is these fringy things hanging from the top of the mouth. We know that the toothed whales have teeth. Teeth come in different shapes and sizes. They are cone-shaped in the dolphins. They can be very long, as we know, in a narwhal. They can be blunted out in a porpoise. So you have very blunt-shaped teeth, or spade-shaped, they're sometimes described as. And then let's take a look at what happens inside the oral cavity. So we've got a mouth here, and food is going into the mouth, and then it hits that larynx that we were talking about before. Here's the larynx, which is locked up into the nose with this little turtleneck cuff holding it in position to make sure that the breathing passageway doesn't interfere with the swallowing passageway, so these animals don't drown. Look at that, completely isolating the digestive tract from the respiratory tract, so that these animals can have air passing through the system even while they're racing through the water, open mouth, upside down, chasing after a fish, because they've isolated the 2 respiratory and digestive tracts into 2 completely separate passageways. Because there's some asymmetry in these animals, by the way, the right passageway is larger than the left, and that might explain why dolphins strand feed or chase fish up on the beach and then grab them, always landing on the beach with their right side down. So that could be because the fish with gravity is going to end up on that side and therefore pass against the larynx in this food passageway on the right side because it's larger. Some animals can't open their mouth all the way. Look at this. These are the strack-toothed whales. Very bizarre animal. The way these animals feed is through suction, because they can't use their teeth to grab anything, because their teeth are basically a big display. They're like antlers, okay? But that keeps them from opening their mouth. So how do they feed? They're essentially vacuum cleaners. And we think that suction feeding actually is a very old way of feeding, because we see some evidence of suction by these horizontal stripe marks that were found on teeth of very old fossil baleen whales. So before the baleen fully came in, they still had some baleen in here, but they also had teeth. And as they pulled the tongue back like a piston, water and prey got sucked into the mouth. That created this horizontal striping of, erosion as sand got pulled against those teeth. So we start with whales that can grasp things with their teeth, to whales chasing smaller prey, to eventually sucking prey in, to eventually what we get in the baleen whales. So here we've gone past the suction feeding and into engulfment feeding. What's engulfment feeding? Well, it's basically what you see when a pelican gets in the water. Pelicans have that big waddle that can stretch out in their throat, and they grab all that water with the fish. Whales are doing the same thing, but not all whales. Most of the whales that have these stripes on the bottom here, these are pleats that are like an accordion that can spread out and allow them to engulf a huge amount of water along with the fish. And then as they collapse this area of the throat, the water is squeezed out of the baleen, which is located here where those little yellow stripes are. And it squeezes through the baleen. Water is going through the baleen plates. Here are baleen plates, and you can see little gaps between each baleen plate, which is where the water is passing through. But the prey gets caught on these little hairy structures, which are facing towards the tongue. So here's the front of a whale. Here's the outside, looks like a comb. Here's the inside, it looks like a brush. So these baleen plates are stacked one against the other, but little gaps in here that allow the water to flow out. Now there's two methods for this straining with baleen. One is to be a sifter or strainer, and the other is to be a gulper. Sifters or strainers allow water to come in through the front, and as they cruise along, they're continuously sifting. Water is continuously straining out through the baleen plates. So here's a diagram looking from above. Water is coming in. It's being directed by the tongue off into this direction. It goes through the baleen, and then it exits at the corner of the mouth. You ever notice these whales have a deep corner of the mouth right before the eye? That's where the water is exiting out that little channel at the bottom there. In the baleen whales, they have that channel also. It's right over here. So water can also exit out that way. But they have very short baleen plates, not like these guys, which are really long. So what they do instead is they engulf a huge amount of water with prey, close this up, and they still squeeze some water out here. But they are stretching this area out and doing it all in one big batch instead of continuously feeding. So they kind of look like big toilet bowls swimming around. So they scoop up all the water into the bowl of the toilet, and then they have to essentially take the lid and close the lid over the toilet bowl. Easier said than done, because they've disarticulated their jaw and thrown it forward. Look, here's the tip of the upper jaw. If you do a normal arc from here, the lower jaw should be here, but it's thrown way forward. So they throw it way out to get even more volume in here. Look, it's overflowing. There's so much volume in here. They shake it around, catch the water in here, and then they have to swim the rest of their body over their lower jaw just so they can close the lid on the top of the toilet. So here's the lid coming down little by little until it finally closes. And now that it's closed, they squeeze the throat plates, and look, there's fountains of water coming out, each of these little streams coming out between each baleen plate. And that's how they're squeezing the water out of that area. If we look at just a short snippet of this video, we'll see a whale doing just that. So here's a humpback whale opening the mouth. Look at the floor of the mouth extend. Look at those throat pleats stretched out, grasp everything in there. And now it has to spit all the water back out. And notice the throat pleats getting smaller as the water is coming out, and it's bubbling up here at the surface, all that water coming out. Here's a whale that's made a net out of bubbles to trap its prey, and it comes up through the center of it to grab its prey. Here's another one. Look, its mouth is open. Look at that. Look at that huge mouth. And, oh, yes, catches everything there. Just amazing watching these animals feed. And because they have such an interesting anatomy in this area, they have to have nerves that can stretch, because this tissue has to stretch tremendously, and they have to still be able to innervate it so that the muscles can work to contract all of that. So they have very, very stretchy nerves. They go out to this huge area of the throat that can expand. The volume of this, by the way, is almost the same as the volume of the whole whale. That's how much they can take in there. And what are these animals eating? Well, the biggest animals in the world are eating some of the smallest animals in the world. So some of them are eating fish, like these humpback whales here. They're feeding on this little fish called menhaden or bunker locally around our area. But in other areas, like where you guys are in California, they may be eating a lot of the krill, the little crustaceans that look like little tiny red shrimp. Here's a whole patch of krill, this red stuff. And here's the humpback whale coming in to feed it. Notice, by the way, the floor of the mouth of this whale is black, because the fish or krill looking down think it's just the deep, dark ocean. They're not scared by that. But if you look at the baleen plates in the roof of the mouth, it's usually lighter in color because that's coming over the top, and it has to look kind of like the sky. So they're counter shaded top and bottom to look like either the deep ocean or the light pale sky, so that the prey isn't scared away by this big mouth coming towards them. Interestingly, fin whales are counter shaded left-right because they feed on their side. So the right side is white. So they feed with their left side down and their right side up, and the downside is black and the upside is white. Very cool. You can kind of appreciate that when you see a side-feeding fin whale. It's very, very cool. Now, whales are carnivores, but they've actually maintained a piece of anatomy that their terrestrial ancestors had, which were herbivores, and that is a multi-chambered stomach. So even though whales don't eat food that they then regurgitate and chew again like cattle do, they still have multi-chambered stomachs. They don't chew their cud. They don't ruminate. But the multi-chambered stomachs are helping to digest their very unusual prey, which has a lot of keratin in it. And so there is some mechanical grinding that goes on in the stomach, and that's part of the reason for the different chambers. Why do they have to grind it? Because they don't have teeth, remember. They're eating all of their prey whole, so they have to rely on the stomach to do some of the mashing for them. And then we get into the rest of their guts, which is probably less interesting because it looks kind of like terrestrial animals. We just have lots of intestines down in here, in this area here. Lots of intestines. Pretty cool. By the way, these were drawn by your friend Ugo Gorder. You know him. He's part of ACSO in your area, right? He might even be on this Zoom with us today. Hello, Ugo, if you're there. So here's lovely intestines in here. Here's the liver. Here's the stomach. Pretty much the same anatomy you have in a terrestrial animal, just packed into a long cylindrical body of the whale. Okay, let's get to our reproductive tract, which you see a little hint of right here. Okay, so we're looking over here. This is reproductive tract. So that's the testes over here. This is the bladder. This is the penis, which is withdrawn so that it's streamlined in the whale. Reproductive anatomy. Okay, and endocrine systems. Well, male and female whales, really hard to tell apart unless the whale turns over and you can see it's under surface, and then it's easy. Females have two small slits, and so they kind of look like a division sign, like a longhand division sign. They got a line and then two dots on either side like that. The line in the middle is kind of like an exclamation point. You get a long line and then a dot for the anus over here. In males, that anus is separated away from the genital slit. The genital slit's much longer, of course, because it has to be able to have the penis extrude through it. So it must be a much longer slit. But there are no side slits because they don't have extrudable teats. These are where the teats are going to come out. These are mating dolphins. In this case, the male is the one underneath. The female gets to swim along normally, and the male has to hold his breath. She can get to the surface. He can't. He has to hold his breath and swim at her speed in order to be able to mate with her. So it is, in a sense, a test of fitness. But what's cool about whales is that they're one of the few animals that can mate belly to belly. When you think about it and look in the animal world, there are very few animals that mate belly to belly. Humans and primates are one example. Manatees and whales. That's kind of it. Sometimes whales might use each other to help. So we've got a belly to belly mating going on, but what's this, menage a trois? Why is there a third one here? Well, this guy over here is the couch. So by positioning himself over here, the female can't escape, and this whale can push against her, and she's not being pushed away into space in the water because there's an object here to help hold her in place. Now, what's in it for this guy? Well, he gets a turn next. So they both will have turns mating with her, which means that there's actually going to be some selection from sperm competition rather than just being the first one to mate. It's the sperm that then have this competition, and there may in fact be some female choice in that. We'll get to that in a second. Let's talk first about the male, because the male has a very interesting penis. I mentioned before how it is anchored on this bone. This is the pelvic bone. This is the retractor muscle that pulls the penis back. The penis is actually looped up like this. It's more of a looped position. When this muscle relaxes, it's like a spring, and the spring unwinds and it pushes the penis out. And so you get these very long penises that are essential because these whales are not really nested against each other all the time in mating, especially in baleen whales. The female might want to be trying to avoid being mated by rolling with her belly facing upward. How does the male reach her? It's got a very long penis that can actually change its positioning and shape so that it can maneuver its way into the opening. Sorry, my cursor is going crazy here. Guess it doesn't like all this. So here we've got two males. This is one male. Here's a second male over here. But you can see the shapes of the penis and how it's curved. This is another male entering into the female here. And this is pretty amazing. This is a harbor porpoise. Look at the length. This is a tiny little guy, right? Little harbor porpoise. And about a third of its length is its penis. What's cool about the penis is it actually has left-handed or right-handed sidedness to it. So the penis is off on one side often, and it has a little kink in it. And this kink over here actually meshes with the kinks inside the vagina. This is the vagina of the female, and this is where the cervix is. And there are all these weird folds in the vagina that this has to navigate through. This is a study where the penile tissue was inserted into the vaginal tissue, which is gray. The penile tissue is red. And you could see how it conforms into the shape. Here's the tip of the penis fitting in the spiral patterns of the end of this vaginal passageway in order to negotiate its movement all the way up through that space. Now, what's really neat is that the females can use these different flaps to sequester sperm off into little blind pouches. So she may not have a choice in being mated, but she may have a choice in whether that sperm makes it to the cervix. So if she doesn't like the one who's mating her, she can actually cover the cervix with a flap and prevent that sperm from getting in until she finds a more suitable mate whose sperm she will let in. And of course, whales being mammals have placental pregnancies and live birth. So they're doing everything a mammal does, but in the water. So they're mating in the water. They're carrying their pregnancy in the water. They're giving birth in the water, usually tail first. Why tail first? Because that way the impulse to breathe is delayed until the whole head is out. And once the head is out, then it's a very short time before the baby needs to get back up to the surface and not waiting throughout the whole labor of getting that animal delivered. So the impulse to breathe won't happen until the mother rolls and breaks the umbilical cord, which is happening here, and then she'll turn around and push that baby up to the surface to take its first breath. Lactation is nursing. That's squirting the milk into the water. You can see some of that milk over here. Now, how does a baby whale nurse when it doesn't have lips? What it uses instead is a tongue. So here's the tongue of a young dolphin. And notice it can curl its tongue and make it into a straw or a tube. And then sticks that tongue out and grasps the teat with the end of the tongue, which has these little fringes on the end here. See these little papillae or fringes? These are like little fingers. They help grip the teat and actually zipper lock finger to finger to close over and lock that teat into the tube. So that's how they grasp and make a tube so that they channel the milk directly in. So it doesn't matter that they don't have lips or cheeks on the side because the tongue is taking over that function. Now here's another really cool thing. Look at this. Sperm whales do something really bizarre. In order to grab the teat, because their mouth is so far back from the end of their face, okay, they actually insert the lower jaw into the vagina. Talk about a dildo jaw. Look at that. They put this jaw into the vagina, and then the teat ends up at the opening of the mouth, and they compress the teeth between the lower jaw and the upper jaw. So they're actually compressing it using the two parts of their jaw, but by inserting the lower jaw into the vagina. That's so bizarre, but it's so different and so practical when you think about it, because how else are you going to get this teat all the way down into this mouth? This mouth is so far away from the end of the face of this animal. It's the only way it can do it. All right, let's talk a little bit about migration. So whales, as you know, migrate from the equator to the pole. If they're in the northern hemisphere, then they'll be feeding in the summer times in the Arctic waters. But the southern hemisphere whales, they're actually up in the tropical waters during that time because that's their winter. They want to be in the tropics for the winter. So whales from the northern hemisphere will then switch and they'll come back to the back to the equator during their winter time, which for the southern hemisphere whales, that's their summertime. So they'll go down to the Antarctic waters to feed. So this is why northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere whales rarely meet, because they're not at the equator at the same time. Now, because they have to do this long migration, they have to carry all the energy necessary for calving, for carrying pregnancy, calving and giving birth to their babies, and then nursing their babies while they're traveling back to the feeding grounds. And this is one of the reasons that female whales of these big migrating species are larger than the males. It's one of the few examples in nature where the female is bigger than the male, because she has to carry all of that extra energy in the blubber, and therefore they need a bigger surface area. So here's the blubber being stripped off of a whale. You get an idea of how thick it is. that blubber not only provides insulation and buoyancy, but also that energy for migration and to maintain the pregnancy, and then after the baby is born, that nursing. Let's talk about the sensory systems now. So we know that dolphin brains and whale brains are very complex brains. They're very convoluted. Having lots and lots of these convolutions means that there's a lot of surface area, and the more surface area, the more processing takes place. Now, people often make the mistake of saying, well, if there's more convolutions to the brain, it's a smarter animal. There is generally a correlation, but it's not a one-to-one like that. It's not necessarily an indication of intelligence as much as it's an indication of complexity of whatever they need to do. So if there's a lot of processing, then the brain will be highly folded to make more surface area. So when we look at a bottlenose dolphin brain compared to a human brain, it looks like it's more complex than the human brain, but there's a lot more processing going on, particularly in its sensory systems for processing sound into basically a pictorial image in their brain. So that may explain some of the complexity of their brain. Nevertheless, they still do have a very complex brain, and they do have very complex social structures that go along with that. But that's not the only thing the brain does. The brain is also responsible for processing all of the other senses. Hearing, for example. Hearing is sensed when sound is transmitted to the eardrum. From the eardrum, it goes to the ossicles, the little bones inside the head, the hammer, the anvil, the stapes. And then from there to the cochlea, the snail-shaped thing inside your head, which actually processes the sound and brings that to the brain. And this is what a cochlea looks like. It's called that because it looks like a snail. And inside are these little hairs, and these little hairs are actually bringing the sensations on nerves back to the brain. So this is sound coming in to the external ear on an animal with a big ear, like a deer over here. Sound is hitting the eardrum, which then moves the malleus or the hammer, which moves the incus, which is the anvil, which then moves the stapes, which is the stirrup, which then pushes on this little window and pushes the fluid in the cochlea. And then the nerves that have little hairs in here pick up the movements and send that signal to the brain. And that is how mammals hear. In whales, this eardrum is not functional. So what's happened instead is there's a tympanoperiodic plexus of bone. And it's thought that that bone rocks, which then rocks the ossicles, the three bones in here, which then pushes on here. What's causing that to rock? It seems to be a pressure wave that comes to it through a fat channel that's in the lower jaw. The external ear, like you see here on a terrestrial mammal, is pretty non-functional in a toothed whale or a baleen whale. Here is the actual external ear. It's a little pinhole just behind the eye. So that's not a very functional pinna. There's nothing there to catch sound. But why do they still even have a hole? Well, there is some thought that the tissue in this area is sensitive to pressure changes and might give information to the whale about how deep it is in the water column, because that little canal may deform and they can sense that canal deforming. So that's an interesting, perhaps new sense, which is a sense of pressure change. Sound, however, is then transmitted into the lower jaw. So here's a skull, you're looking at it from below, and the lower jaw is colored pink. Sound is coming into the jaw, and then it's channeled along fat that lies in the jaw until it gets back to the ear, which is this red part right back here. So they are hearing with their lower jaw, using the left and right sides of the jaw, like as if they were two ears to catch sound. These are other pictures of the skull, and again, you can see the fat bodies on the side over here. These are basically the ears of the whale. Here's the fat inside the jaw on the side here. So there's some on the outside and some on the inside. This is from the work of Darlene Ketton, where she had these beautiful scans, and you can see the fat going into the hollow. So the jaw is very unusual because it's hollow. Most animals don't have a hollow jaw, but why is a hollow jaw okay in these animals? Well, it can be used for sound progression because it's not being used to crunch things. These animals are not breaking chestnuts with their jaw. They don't need a strong jaw because they don't manipulate their food with their jaw the way we do. They don't chew anything. They just use their jaw to trap stuff, and that's about it. So it can be a relatively weak jaw and hollow on the inside and serve this function for sound production. So we've got echolocation coming out, bounces off the fish, comes back through the jaw, and from there is transmitted back to the ear. And that is why, although hearing is passive and sound production is active, you need both in order to sense the environment. So echolocation relies on acoustic fats not only in the forehead to focus the sound, but also in the jaw to receive that sound. So it all depends on being fatheads. Baleen whales might be doing something similar because they also have some jaw fats, but they have something else in addition. And that is they have a very interesting tympanic bulla that seems to rock back and forth with a very thin attachment to the skull. It's thought that the entirety of the skull may actually be receiving some of the low frequency sound waves and acting like a giant antenna to receive the sound. Because let's face it, baleen whales have to hear in the low frequency range, and low frequency sounds are very, very long wavelengths. Each peak is very far apart. So you need a very large receptor in order to sense the difference between one peak and the next. The smaller your receptor is, the less likely you are to be able to perceive a low frequency sound. So this may explain in part why baleen whales develop such large heads so that they could use their skull to receive low frequency sounds. And then talking about sounds, the cochlea, of course, is where that sound is processed and then picked up by the nerves to go to the brain. But there's another part in here called the semicircular canals, these little loops in here. This is what it looks like in a blue whale. Here's a beaked whale. Here's a dolphin. Here, now it's colored yellow. This is a bush baby, okay? And none of these were scaled to be the same size, okay? They didn't manipulate it to make it bigger. This is actual size and actual size. So if we're looking at a bush baby relative to a dolphin, bush baby is a tiny little animal, but it lives in a very three-dimensional environment in the jungle. So why is it that a bush baby has really large semicircular canals? Because it's navigating a three-dimensional arboreal or tree habitat. So why doesn't a dolphin have that? Look at the dolphin. It's much smaller. Look at these tiny little semicircular canals. It seems paradoxical that they have really tiny semicircular canals because they're also in a three-dimensional environment in the water. So we don't really have a good explanation for that. One explanation I heard was, well, it would make them nauseous, so they kind of turn it off. I don't buy it. I don't think that's it at all. I think that the vestibular sense is very difficult to maintain with the acceleration these animals do underwater, which is very fast compared to a bush baby crawling around on the tree branches. And therefore, the acceleration of those fluids may confuse the animal in terms of its vestibular sense. But I think they make up for it with a different sense, and that is a sense of gravity. Because of their buoyancy, they always know which way is up, because they know which way floats, which way does air go, which way does their body tend to float or sink. So they're very aware of pressure changes and buoyancy, and I think that's how they orient, and they don't need the semicircular canal input because they're getting that sense from other parts of their body that can sense gravity. Vision is very cool with whales because whales spy hop. They can see out of the water as well as under the water. And their eye is really super cool. Oops, sorry. Because the pupil isn't round, except when it's wide open. When they start to close their pupil, they have this little dip, like pulling a window shade down. And when they pull it all the way down, there's two little pinholes on either side. So there's 2 points where they can focus, not one like in us, but 2. And it's not entirely clear to us why there are 2, but it could be that one focuses for above water and one focuses for below water. Super interesting. Another cool thing about their eye is that they have a really, really thick covering on the outside of the eye. This is the front of the eye where it meets the water surface. This is where the nerve goes back into the brain. Okay, this is where all of the reception is processed. This is the retina over here. But this is the sclera, or the thick part of the whites of the eye, if you will. That is so incredibly thick on whales. Look at how thick that is. On a human, it would just be a very thin little line like that. But on whales, it's super, super thick. And the explanation I always have heard about this is, well, it prevents the eye from deforming at depth when they dive. I don't buy it. Why? Because fluids are relatively incompressible, and the inside of the eye is filled with fluid. So why would it need all that protection? I think the answer really lies in understanding where the eye is in the skull. And whale skulls are highly unusual because they don't have closed eye sockets the way we do. So when a whale is using its jaw muscles to close, especially baleen whales, and pulling that huge jaw back, the jaw muscles and the jaw bone actually impinges on the orbital space from below. So the eye needs a lot of protection so it doesn't deform because of all these things passing through the bottom of the orbit, because they don't have a sealed bony orbit the way we do. Think about it for a minute. If you are chewing, you don't have to worry about your eye focusing. But if you ever seen a deer on the side of the road, it'll stop chewing to look at you as you drive by. Why? Because it can't focus on you while it's chewing, because its orbit is also open on the bottom. No surprise, because deers are related to the ancestors of whales. They have the same anatomy. So when a deer is chewing, its eyeball is going boingy, 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 because the muscles are going right past the bottom of the eye in that open orbit. Whales have the same problem, and that's probably why they made this very thick covering around the eye. And then if we get into the inside of the eye, it's pretty cool because whales actually do see in color, but they only see one color. So they see in color, but they only see blue. So it's basically as if they don't see in color because it's all monochromatic, but it is various shades of blue that they see. Baleen whales have lost the functionality of almost all of their cones. They basically use just rods, which are what give you the contrast of dark and light. But that makes some sense because baleen whales are hunting their prey generally at the surface in large schools. They just need to see the shadow where it is relative to the surface as they come up from below. Whereas toothed whales may be using a little bit of vision as well as the echolocation, so they might need a little bit more vision in terms of trying to make out the shapes of things. And then we have snout whiskers. This is pretty cool because a lot of whales have little whiskers at the tips of their snouts. Look at all these little whiskers here at the tip of the humpback whale's snout. Here's some whiskers over here on a right whale. Look at these little whiskers, bristles sticking out. And here's some whiskers on a baby dolphin. We know that these animals are born with whiskers, and it's always been the argument for saying, well, they're mammals. Yeah, because they're warm-blooded, they give milk, they have pregnancies with placentas, and they have hair. And here's the hair. Here's what's left of the hair. But the hair usually falls out in the babies, and you don't see it in the adults. And so it's like, oh, it was just vestigial hair that fell out. Well, there's some interesting evidence that in the adults, it actually has a function, because these little pits, when they were examined histologically, look like they are actually electroreceptors. So the hairs are basically whiskers, but not necessarily in the same kind of tactile sensation that a cat might have, but something a little bit different. And it's not just toothed whales. Here's the front of the lower jaw of a baleen whale. And look, it also has these pits on either side. This is the midline of the jaw facing straight out at you. So why would they have it? It could be that they're using these receptors to sense the electromagnetic field of their prey, kind of like sharks do. Take a look at this dolphin in this next video. It's plunging its head into the sand and most likely using those electromechanical receptors to sense where that prey is. There, it just grabbed the fish. To sense where that fish was inside the sand. Pretty cool. They also may use some of this sensory apparatus to determine how stretched the lower jaw is. Because as baleen whales, especially the rorqual whales, open up their lower jaw to engulf prey, this left and right jaw separates, and this little fat pad here gets stretched. And so the nerves in here are sensing how much stretch there is, so they know just how far apart their jaw is. And then we get into the smarts aspects. Okay, we talked about senses. What else does the brain do? It's in charge of how smart these animals are. And here's the best evidence for smart whales are tool users. Here's a dolphin using a sponge as if it were a glove, so it doesn't get roughed up by sticking its snout in among the rocks to chase things out. Here's a dolphin using a shell as a tool. It was actually plowing the dirt with this shell to try and disrupt things that come up from the bottom. Here is a river dolphin smacking the surface with some seaweed to try and chase the fish into one area. Here's a dolphin kicking up mud in a pattern like this to trap fish in the middle. Gee, doesn't this look a lot like something you've seen in baleen whales? Here it is. Here's that spiral of bubbles using air as a tool instead of mud to trap fish in the middle. Pretty amazing. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of whale intelligence. I don't think I'm going to have time to play this video, but you can probably look it up online from Animal Planet. It's a pilot whale that's basically giving a lesson to this swimmer who was harassing it, and it took her for it took her for a little dive down and then released her. And so she got scared because, you know, she thought she was not going to be able to breathe at the surface anymore. But the whale didn't eat her, but it did bite her leg and bring her down. And that's a punishment. It was basically punishing her. Here's something cool. This is a seal sitting on an ice floe. And this shows you how whales communicate to each other. You're going to see a, oops, come back here. You're going to see a whale. Why is it not working? Come here. Oh, I guess it's not going to do it. I'll just tell you what it was. So there was a whale in here that's going to raise up, and then these other whales swim in a formation to create a bow wave that then washes that seal off of the ice floe. So it's communication, allowing them to coordinate their swimming pattern so that they can hunt together. Yeah, I guess it's not going to work. Let's see if this won't work. This is a dolphin looking at a mirror underwater and recognizing that it's itself in the mirror. It's like, I can't swim through it. It's not glass. That's weird. What if I twist? Does it twist? What if I release air? Like that. So it's just exploring its image in the mirror, which I find fascinating. This dolphin over here, on the other hand, had someone mark something on its head. And so it's trying to see the marking in the mirror. It recognizes that it's itself in the mirror because it's looking for the mark that it knows is on his head. Pretty cool. So mirror self-recognition is a sign of high intelligence of these whales. Play is also a sign of high intelligence. These are wild belugas that are playing and interacting with a photographer by spitting at her. These are dolphins that are doing cooperative fishing with some fishermen. I think this is in Brazil. When the dolphins have corralled the fish, they signal the fisherman by doing this leap, and then the fisherman throws the net, catches the fish, and then tosses the fish to the dolphin so that they don't have to chase after the fish to catch them, because now the fish have been somewhat disabled by being caught in the net. So they are cooperatively fishing and both benefit. And then my favorite is actually interspecies play. There are two examples here on the right, top and bottom, of dolphins interacting with humpback whales in two different locations. One where the dolphin is being carried around like it's on a lounge chair over here. And this one over here where the humpback whale lifts its head and the dolphin slides down like a kid's slide pond in the park. And then once it slides off, it just swims right back on top to do it up again. And the humpback whales tolerate it because they think it's just as much fun. So it's pretty cool that these animals can play in an interspecies fashion. And I think that's one of the best signs of intelligence is play. So I hope you've enjoyed that tour of whale anatomy. And I'm happy to stay on. I know it's been almost 2 hours, and I thank you for all your patience for those of you who stayed on, but I'm happy to take a look at some of the questions you've submitted and see what there is to look at.